Well, good afternoon, and let me say it's very liberating to see all of you here today. I've had the pleasure of working with young people most of my life. I've reached the conclusion that their ideas and their energy, right? Sorry, excuse me.
Nice.
Boy. Maybe it's good news. Maybe I should have taken this one to give you some more good news, but I don't think that's the case. But I have had the pleasure of working with young people most of my life, and I've reached the conclusion that their ideas and energy have significantly shaped social justice movements throughout our history. And students have repeatedly led with generous spirits and loving hearts. I say this because the Pride Club at FSU PC on our campus sponsored today's event. And I just wish to remind its members that they are part of a long tradition of student activists that have made our world a far more equitable place. And I am also most thankful that they have reaffirmed and reawakened the university's role and responsibility to social justice. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. So today in the audience we have several people who have built and led grassroots organizations to protect and expand the rights of our LGBTQ community. And I would encourage you to talk with them about their experiences creating, funding, and expanding their organizations, especially in the funding part. But my remarks today will focus on one aspect of the process, and that is power. And the question is why? And I think it's because sometimes we feel a little uncomfortable talking about power. How do we achieve power? How do we exercise power democratically? Will power change who I am? Yet power is the goal of most, if not all, grassroots organizing efforts. So let's talk about it. So where does power fit into this triad of community organizing, of people, power, and change? Power, I would argue, is built from the ground up when people make decisions for themselves. Decisions made from the top down are rarely satisfying and they rarely last. Power, and let's chat a little bit about the way in which sometimes we define how we exercise that power. And if we can, let's focus our attention on three of those areas. The first one would be the electoral arena. It is important that organizations elect the folks who will represent your shared vision and are here to represent your best interests. In the legislative arena, of course, you want to be able to influence legislators in ways that pass laws which, again, protect your rights and your freedoms. But the area of judicial, what I'll call judicial and constitutional area, which Michelle, you've addressed so nicely a few minutes ago, sometimes it's one that we kind of forget, that the courts have historically provided support for and protection for minority rights. And in the process, probably have made our society far more democratic than any of the other branches of government. And I would say to those of you who are most progressive or most radical, you may also want to challenge the current economic system because neoliberalism has not worked for any of us, whether we are LGBTQ or whether we are underrepresented in other aspects of our life. So when we take a look at this triad, people are extremely important in terms of that grassroots notion of making decisions for yourself. Power, I would say, is probably best exercised in the areas that we just mentioned. And change. Change, we sometimes think of change as a bit overwhelming, or it's hard for us to kind of quantify in some instances change. I would argue that, at least in this model, when we think about change, we need to think about change in a very specific way. We need to think about change in a very concrete way. We need to think about change in significant ways and in very winnable ways. So for the community organizers who are in the audience, you understand that wins, especially early on in the movement, are critical to the morale and to the trust building within your organization. So it's okay to target a small win, but I would say never lose sight of the fact that real power is exercised in the areas we just mentioned: electoral, legislative, judicial, and economic. So let's talk a little bit about various aspects of power. We already mentioned people power. So let me focus my attention actually on two of these. The first one I would like to address is the issue of alliance and coalition building. There is a quote from Audre Lorde, which I think sums it up perfectly. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. So the extent to which grassroots organizations which protect LGBTQ plus rights can work with other organizations, and in a minute we'll talk a little bit about civil rights organizations, talk a little bit about immigrants' rights organizations, but I'll focus my attention on labor, especially labor unions, given the spirit of today's conference. But coalition building is critical, right? Sometimes you hear the term, we need a bigger we, and sometimes that bigger we comes through alliances in addition to expanding your base. Don't underestimate the power of narrative power to shape public discourse on issues. It can transform thinking, and it will transform thinking. The current issue that I am wrestling with now pretty much deals with trans athletes. One of my subfields is sports and sports history, and I'm trying to do my best to transform some thinking around some archaic thinking or some prejudicial thinking around that issue. And then finally, governance power to shape, the institutional decision-making that will constitute real, powerful, and significant change. But I think the other issue here, too, deals with systemic oppression. Unless you are able to undo the years of law, the years of policy, the years of practice, which have contributed to this burdensome sense of systemic oppression, especially against LGBTQ people, unless we're able to do that, we're not fulfilling what it is I think we need to fulfill. So let me talk, if I can, for a second about where I cut my teeth, which was in labor organizing. Right? And my affiliation with labor, my attraction to labor, came from the sense that we need to protect people's rights on the job. Now, many of you, when you graduate here from FSU, will take a position where you may have a union. That's especially true if you are working in the public sector. And I want to argue, at least today, that in some cases labor unions are your best protection on the job in terms of discrimination for who you are. If you work for a company that has a union, right, and there is a collective bargaining agreement which has been approved by both parties are bound to that collective bargaining agreement, and that collective bargaining agreement offers protections against discrimination, it offers avenues for due process, and it offers avenues for if you have been discriminated against because of your sexual orientation, there is a grievance procedure in which you can have those issues addressed. Right? So my argument has always been that gay rights are also union rights. And for a long time, unions did not really pay too much attention to this, but I'm happy to say that with an organization called Pride at Work, which is sponsored by the AFL-CIO, those kinds of procedural rights have been secured. Now, it's always nice when I'm in the room with an attorney, because these are issues that that sometimes, I sort of debate in my head, or sometimes I'm not really sure. But when it comes to issues of whether or not an individual can bring suit for discrimination on the job, or for an unfair firing or whatever, oftentimes a judge will ask, do you belong to a union, or are you working in a union shop? And if the answer is yes, you have to exhaust the grievance machinery first before you can take your case into the courts. And it is the intent of that union to make sure that those issues in those cases are settled. There is procedures within a union contract to make individuals whole, which to make sure that whatever they have lost in the process of being discriminated against or mistreated, that those benefits will come to you. So in terms of coalitional power, we know from the literature that LGBTQ plus organizations have had significant success with immigrant rights groups, civil rights groups mostly, but I would still argue that power does still come from numbers, and the extent to which you can build your base through coalitional power is critical. So there are various levels of power, and there are various ways we can talk about power. But certainly power within your organization is critical, because you can always use that power within your organization to leverage your next campaign or your next target. But for me, it's always who has the power in your community. You need to know that. You need to understand who has the political or the financial or the social or the cultural power. But you also need to understand who does not. And it is our mission, it has always been our mission, to make sure that we can provide some greater equity when it comes to power within our communities. As you know, power is never given. It has to be seized, and that gets back to the issue of organizing. Grassroots organizations are all about organizing people, but they're all about at least providing a message, and at least getting the word out there in terms of what the issues are. But power, like I said, is something that we have to consciously think about and consciously have to prepare for. So, in closing, I want you to become comfortable with the notion of queer power. I want that to be a comfortable phrase for you. And if I can read just the bottom part here, when it is time to get ready to take to the streets to demonstrate your people power or your organizational power, build that power to fight against, at least in Florida and many other places, the power that be, right? Folks who are attempting to strip you of your rights, attempting to strip us of our rights to health care, to safe and secure housing, and really to so much more. So, in closing, let me say that time and time again you will hear a common refrain, and that common refrain is, don't expect things to change. Things have been this way for a long time. And I'm going to offer you one response to that common refrain. And that refrain is to look that person straight in the eye and tell them to wake up and start dreaming about a world that maybe they've never imagined. So thank you.
So I have the first question. How do we start? So let's say we want to get a union in our organization. Where do I begin?
Yeah, so where do you begin, sort of like that?
Where do you start?
Yeah, as an old labor organizer, I can give you the National Labor Relations Board's list of how you can bring a union into your workplace. It's not that difficult. But there are informal strategies, and then there's a fairly strict legal process you have to take before the company will recognize or your union will be certified. I can tell you that in working with unions in the past, there are some very progressive unions, but there are some unions that are not progressive. And when I'm asked to speak to union groups or union organizations, my message is usually, you have to democratize your union before you can really sort of serve as a model for the protection and expansion of other people's rights. But it's not as difficult as you would think. In Florida, however, the current situation, and that's something that our faculty union is dealing with now, the current administration has established a 60% threshold of folks who have to belong to the union before it will be recognized. If we don't hit that 60%, then we become decertified. And that would be an outright disaster because union contract protections, which again are sacred in the law, they have to be recognized and enforced by both parties. They are one of your best protections, I would say, to workplace rights.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
Any questions? So you're comfortable with the concept of queer power?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to be able to get the message out there, and it's another thing to be able to change the world and how it operates, and that takes power. So don't feel uncomfortable, all right? By seizing power and taking power when you can, at whatever level you can. Don't feel uncomfortable with that. Nothing inherently undemocratic about power if you exercise it in the right way. So thank you very much for your time.